Okay, so Henning Meyer, thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. We've got a number of questions to cover. When I sent them to you, you said to me that you thought we could talk all day about these things, and I'm sure that's true. But we'll try to keep ourselves to a reasonable period of time. But the first question I've got is, for the people who are watching this, can you just tell them what you do now? You combine the academic and consulting worlds, and perhaps you'd just like to describe that.
Yes, I mean, I come from academia, so I've got an academic background, and I started off as a political scientist, did my first master's and a PhD in British and European politics and in comparative politics. But then also, I've always been interested in sort of entrepreneurial endeavor and business as well. So I also then pursued an executive MBA at business school. I also then, because I'm also interested in economics, and a lot of these issues are obviously, hanging together and straddle the areas of politics, business, and economics. I looked into finance, so then I pursued an MSc in financial economics, and towards the end of my sort of formal education, I pursued a global diploma in global business at Said Business School at Oxford. That was the last bit that I did. So basically, with this sort of academic background, and I used to work at the university as well. So I was a senior research fellow, and I was also teaching at the university. And ever since I started my own companies in 2010, I keep university affiliations. Currently at the London School of Economics and the Public Policy Group, and at the Center for Business Research at the University of Cambridge. And I'm also a future World Fellow at the IE University in Madrid, which is trying to find sort of policy solutions for technological changes that are happening. And so basically, this is my topical background is in politics, economics, and business, and I'm particularly interested in the intersections of the three areas. And I personally work in my academic work, sort of my intellectual work, at the intersection of public policy and business at the moment. In terms of my entrepreneurial activities, I co-founded a digital media publisher 15 years ago called Social Europe. Which has still run my consultancy activities are now merged into Social Europe as well. The company is now called Social Europe Publishing and Consulting at GmbH. So I refounded it last year when I relocated from London after 15 years to Berlin, where I'm now based. And basically, yes, we try to publish in different digital formats ideas that are relevant for the political process. So our main activity is trying to, and especially also linking to academia, trying to unearth some of the best ideas and providing them in digital formats that are easily absorbable for people that are part of the policy making on the political process, because they don't. Academics like to think about that this way, but they don't read academic journals. So so that's one of the key things that the company does. And my own personal consultancy activities are in this area as well. So I develop ideas in my academic work that are then popularized with talks and seminars and similar activities. But I also then dabble in executive education. I was teaching corporate diplomacy, for instance, in Cairo last year. So the red thread to these activities, if you wish, so it's all knowledge driven. It's all trying to combine issues in politics, economics, and business, and trying to come up with strategic solutions for businesses, but also primarily policymakers.
Very important work today in the world that we're living in. I'm especially interested in your publishing company, finding new ways and taking advantage of technology to communicate things more effectively to people, to encourage greater understanding of the world as it is today. I think is very important. That seems very valuable. But we're going to talk about technology and globalization today. And for those who are watching this video, many of them may be less familiar with globalization. So could I just start by asking you to describe what it is and why it's so important?
Yeah, I mean, globalization is commonly understood in the wake that in the wake after the end of the Cold War, there was a faster integration of the world, right? So the two blocks disappeared that shaped the power balance in the decades of the Cold War, and that led to well, some people call it the end of history, but it never was. But that led to effectively a Western model of capitalism spreading throughout the world, and that model of capitalism was accompanied also by opening up of borders, which led to distribution of capital and people. So there was also, because information technology also matured during the 1990s, so there was also a much bigger sort of distribution of cultural elements as well. So cultures that usually did not interact at all, or in previous decades, got in contact with each other, and it was just the whole idea of a world that is integrating. That is basically at the heart of globalization, and it also produced a lot of problems. And one of the key problems that we probably come back to when we talk about technology is inequality, economic inequality in particular, because in this brave new world of integrated markets, of global capitalism. A lot of people were able to take opportunity of these new circumstances. You heard, and the buzzwords of the day were outsourcing, and things like that, turning Asia at that time into the workbench, so to speak. The low-skill manufacturing was outsourced, reducing costs, so on and so forth. So that had effects in Western countries as well, and especially inequality has been one of the consequences, rising inequality, especially across the Western world. So and a lot of sort of the political grievances that we see even today, but what also started, in the wake of this globalization development and some of the less desirable social and economic consequences that it brought with it.
Thank you. And so globalization is one part of what we're talking about. Technological change is another element. And there are various views, I guess, of how the capabilities of technology develop and how it is applied in the world. And so I'm interested in your view of what determines how technology's capabilities develop and how we decide to use it in society.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great books out there on technology and how it develops. I mean, the Second Machine Age by Brynjolfsson McAfee, for instance, is a very interesting one, and I largely agree with their assessment that innovation is basically not reinventing the wheel every time, but innovation is basically a combination and recombination of existing elements. So most of innovation works that way. And what these authors have argued is that we have reached a maturity level in some of the key technologies that allowed many more of those combinations and recombinations. And the three underlying drivers or sort of key technologies seem to be sensors. So everybody is carrying smartphones. You have sensors everywhere, really. So sensors producing a lot of data. The second one is computing power. So how to process that data. So if you see what artificial intelligence is capable of in these days, and even though Moore's law in terms of increasing processing power might be in trouble at some point, but the advancement has nevertheless been very, very significant and very impressive. So computing power, that making sense out of this, and also networks. So everything seems to be networked. So basically creating the data with sensors, networking the data together, and then making sense out of it with computing power. Those seem to be, for a lot of technologies, the key drivers behind rapidly increasing innovation. So and I broadly concur with that. But at the same time, one has to be careful. I mean, my 5 cents, or some of my 5 cents to this debate was basically what I called 5 filters, which is basically not everything that is technologically possible will also be implemented immediately and in full scale. So that's some sort of a missing link that a lot of thinking, I think, is missing. So just because it's possible to do it doesn't mean, it'll impact your and my life immediately and in full scale. And the question then I ask myself is why? So what are these moderating forces? What is preventing this from happening? And I came up with these 5 ideas, 5 filters. The first one I called an ethical filter. That applies straight in the research. So there are ethical standards in the actual research that limit to what you can do. They are different in different countries, but I mean, recently you probably heard about the announcement that there was the first sort of embryo that was artificially created in China, right? So that was a big outcry out of, rightly so, because that was violating the ethical research standards that a lot of people see as boundaries that you shouldn't cross. So that's one key example. Even if you can do it technically, there are ethical standards that needs to be adhered to that limit to what you can actually do with what is technologically possible. The second one is a social filter. You've always had that to an extent, from the Luddites in the 19th century onwards, that a lot of technology is also resisted for social reasons, be it jobs being destroyed or others. So not every technology is just socially accepted immediately for one reason or the other, and pushback, for instance, against Uber in certain cities, and things like that. These are, I think, good examples for how social resistance can still very much shape how technology is actually implemented in the real world. There's also a governance filter, or even a corporate governance filter. So especially if you look at it from a company level, whether it's a codetermination corporate governance that we have in Germany, for instance, or a sort of a more Anglo-Saxon model, the way companies are run will change the way in which they implement technology. Whether you have a predisposition, for instance, to let go of workers, or do you think, now the working force, even though they might not be doing the exact same tasks anymore that they used to do, they still have a lot of knowledge that we can use in other ways and keep them in the company. So, considerations that are pretty much also baked into corporate governance procedures will have a difference in how technology is implemented. And the last two, obviously, there's a legal filter. Not everything is legal, even though it's possible. I mean, self-driving cars, the technology side of things seems to be pretty much solved, but you don't see them on the streets in Toronto or Berlin or London or anywhere, not least because liability and issues like that are not really solved. So there are some legal issues to contend with as well. And the last one, and that's also a very important one, I think, it's a product, what I call a productivity filter. And that really came out of a conversation I had with the MIT economist David Autor a few years ago. And there was a very interesting part of the conversation. Not every technology is literally just improving productivity so much. It really depends on the task. And the funny example that he used was he was attending some sort of conference, and somebody said, this washing machine has got more processing power than the Apollo moon program. And he said, if I remember correctly from the top of my head, everybody was supposed to be in awe of this, but he just thought diminishing marginal returns, right? Mm-hmm. So, because no matter what the processing power of the Apollo moon program was, it brought people onto the moon. And no matter what the processing power of the washing machine is, it will only do your washing. So you might be able to save a bit of water, or you might be able to start it from a smartphone app or something like this, but it doesn't transform fundamentally what the device actually does. Mm-hmm. So really, how much does it improve the washing? So this is an example where, because of diminishing marginal returns, where technology is being implemented, but it doesn't really change what it's doing, and what the device is doing. And also there are other examples where technology just is not the productivity bottleneck. If you or I write an academic article or any sort of article, our computer can be yet 20 times faster, and it's already God knows how many times faster than in the 1990s, right? But we won't write any faster because the bottleneck is not the speed of the computer in this particular case, but we are the bottleneck, right? So we are the producers of the text, of the of the actual product. So really distinguishing, and that's also where in my sort of consultancy work, where a starting point for organizations or companies should be in thinking about this, what does it actually mean for us, right? If I'm a newspaper, right, so implementing the latest computer technology might not be a priority because, you know, your writers won't have any added productivity benefit out of this. So I think you have to be, and these are just the 5 filters that I came up with. So this is by no means a closed list. So, but at least these 5 forces I could think of that have an impact that shows how society moderates what is technologically possible, and you know what comes out of it at the end and what is actually implemented. These are not the same things. And in the discussion about how technology is transforming societies, I think that's often a black box or not explicitly spelled out. And I think for analytical clarity, I think it's important to spell this out.
Yeah, I thought the 5 filters model was very helpful in understanding or creating a framework for understanding technological change. So I'm glad you've talked about it. The next thing I wanted to ask was, you've talked about a global wave of technological development that would fundamentally alter economies. So basically what you're saying is that technological globalization is having a fundamentally different impact. It's going to make big change in the world. So I'm interested in understanding how you think that wave is going to influence globalization and the world, and why this might be different from what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it already has had a transformative impact, and it will have an even more transformative impact going forward. But I'm not in the game, as many are, in trying to predict certain specific changes. The simple answer is, I mean, if you compare the sort of the modeling of what, for instance, labor market consequences of technology would be, you literally get everything from Armageddon on the labor market to actually there will be a net creation of jobs. You know, as every economist knows, it really depends on the modeling and what you put in. Right, so that's what comes out at the end of it. The honest answer, I mean, academically speaking, that's obviously a good exercise. You know, a lot of people can get involved in that debate, the pros and cons of different modeling techniques and so on and so forth. But that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the policy and strategic consequences of that. And if the situation is as such that, you know, you have such a bandwidth of analysis, the honest answer is nobody knows what the impact is going to be. So you have to prepare for different scenarios, and you have to identify drivers. So again, similar to the 5 filters, you're exactly right. I try to establish a framework of thinking rather than saying, you know, I have a model that pretty sort of specifically predicts outcome X. Because I don't think literally that's possible, because, you know, it really depends on the model. And what I try to do is try to create frameworks for thinking that can then be adjusted to specific situations of organizations, of policymakers, and so on and so forth, to structure their thoughts and come up with sort of certain decisions, right? So, if you take the example of technology and labor market, I'm not going to say 53% in the United States or 20% in Germany and so on and so forth, but I try to identify what are the drivers. And again, I identify 3 drivers, which are substitution, augmentation, and creation. So basically, in the labor market, you have a substitution in 2 ways. First of all, where jobs literally disappear because they can be fully automated, right? So that substitution effect does exist. The question is what quantity, right? And how many jobs are affected. You have a second substitution effect, which is where the job itself disappears, but the task itself does not disappear. So that's the gig economy effectively. So the task itself is still there, but if you think of jobs as sort of a combination or a sum of certain tasks, These tasks are split up and outsourced, by the gig economy or something like that. Say, look for instance at transcription services, whatever. You used to have maybe secretaries whose is still there?
Yes, I'm still here. We had a little pause, but I think we're back.
Yeah. Okay. So if you think, for instance, look at secretarial work, right? So some of these jobs involve sort of transcribing audio notes and things like that. So that's usually now done externally. So that's being outsourced via the gig economy. Whereas the task, and it will probably be fully automated at some point, but mostly at the moment it's still not. So in the substitution area, you have to think about, what is completely automated, where the actual tasks are completely automated, and how are technologies used, platforms and the like, to get the tasks done in a different way. I think in the near future, the most important one is the augmentation area, which is basically trying to identify how the relationship.
You're still there.
All right, and another bip.
It paused. Let's see. You're back now. I think it's okay at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. So in the augmentation area, it's about how the relationship between human workers and machines is changing. I think in the near future the key area to look at. I'll give you one example. If you now go to a supermarket in London, you're very unlikely to see 10 checkout desks anymore, right? Where we're staffed with people, where people scan the barcode of products. You're much more likely in these days to see 10 checkout machines supervised by one person, right? So that's one example where you had a different relationship now between how the human labor works with machines. Obviously, that has a quantitative aspect. You used to have 10 people at checkout desks. Now you have one person supervising checkout machines. And second of all, the qualification profile has also changed. Whereas, it used to be very low skill work, just scanning barcodes and, taking the money from the customer. And now at least some sort of rudimentary technical skills needs to be there, because if something goes wrong with the machines, at least some of the easier problems, the supervisor probably should be able to solve on the spot rather than calling in the manufacturer or some other service company. So that's one example how the relationship between human labor and machines is changing, and what kind of quantitative and qualitative aspects that will have. And at the same time, obviously, we'll always have job creation, and job creation will continue to happen. I mean, the job as social media manager didn't exist some time ago. Data analyst, these sort of jobs that really didn't exist until most recently. So there is a clear element of job creation as well. But the question is who will be these jobs for? Will these people who might be displaced, will these new jobs be available for them, or will we see downward social mobility? Research in the United States seems to suggest that you have downward social mobility. So what I think David also called the dumbbell model, where sort of the middle is thinning out, and you have very well-paid, high quality jobs at the top end, and very low-skilled personal service or labor jobs, services at the lower end. Sort of you see the spread of nail bars, sort of gardening services, all of these sort of things. And you can think about this in terms of sort of just take the one job, the biggest job in the United States, truck driver, lorry driver. If you have the situation that in a few years they are fully autonomously driving trucks, so what is the likelihood? Where will these displaced truck drivers go? It seems unlikely to me, even if you might invest a lot in retraining, which you definitely should, that they become software engineers anytime soon. So it's more likely that there is a downward social mobility trajectory. That these people will move downward and end up in a sort of lower skilled service sector jobs. So I think, again, from the top of my head, if I remember correctly, so what used to be typical teenager jobs, flipping burgers and things like that, it's not exclusively limited to teenagers anymore. So, but a lot of this sort of downwardly socially mobile people who were displaced from their previous work are ending up there. So that is obviously a question. And again, if you see, and this is linking it back to globalization, if you look at this dumbbell model and how technology then works, one of the key features is it tends to create winner-takes-all markets and monopolies or oligopolies. So again, so that tends to accentuate inequality tendencies. We talked about how globalization has already produced inequality to a large extent. So this is coming on top. So, and you have two basic channels. First of all, in the actual markets, the structure of winner takes all tends to, concentrate market power in a few players, which will create inequality in that sense because they become rent seekers and, crowd everybody else out. And the other one is via the labor market channel and the downward social mobility threat. That I just described, right? So, a lot of people are probably unlikely to find equally qualitative jobs of an equal quality, and that will tend to increase inequality as well. So this is where, via the inequality channel, I would make the connection between what we've seen in the 1990s and early 2000s with globalization, and where technology now comes as a driver on top of this.
Thank you. And so you've described particularly the impact that technology might have on work and the resulting inequality and perhaps pain for many people. You've also talked about there being a need for a social democratic response to this new technology-influenced globalization. What do you think that response should be, and how does it differ from other responses that might be possible from other political perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, interesting, when I started looking at the labor market consequences, okay, if these are the threats and under some scenarios, the substitution effect is much bigger than job creation and augmentation. And even if it's not, the new jobs are not available for the ones who are losing the jobs, as we just discussed. So what are political or potential political solutions? And in the discussion about this, you hear very often the idea of a basic income. Or universal basic income. And it's funny, it's a very funny thing. What should make you think straight away is that sort of Silicon Valley libertarians like the idea as well as the hard left. So so that should give you pause for thinking straight away why that would be. And in terms of how Silicon Valley libertarians, as I understand it, see this concept is basically buying themselves free of any wider social responsibility. It's basically saying, yes, I know we have to look after society, we have to look after people, but so everybody gets a minimum and a basic income, and that's it. There's also an economic effect, though, which is not often talked about, is that obviously for all these technological services, you need consumers. So it's not just good to have supply if nobody's consuming it. So, and to my mind, a lot of people think, in the technology world, think about it also in this way, that this is propping up the demand for the services, because otherwise, who's going to take the Ubers? Who's going to demand all these services that are there? So, the fundamental laws of economics do still apply. Right, so and you might have a supply, but you do not have automatically demand for it. So, so the economy is still driven by supply and demand. So that's one thing. But if you have a different political perspective, sort of a social democratic perspective, that cannot be enough. And my criticism. Again, I came up with sort of 5 points about what my main criticisms are of why the basic income is not a viable policy solution for the threat of technological unemployment. The first one is it reduces work to income. right? Because it just replaces the income component of work. But if you read a bit of sociology, you know that work is much more than just income. So all the social interaction in the workspace, you spend most of your waking hours in the place you work. It's an important source of social interaction. It's an important source of self-confidence. Right? All of this is completely pushed aside. The social elements of work, if from the basic income, because it literally just replaces the income component of work, but work is much more than just the income. So first of all, I don't think that reducing it in that way is good. Second one, I think it's a bad allocation of scarce resources. The universal basic income obviously is paid to everybody via a tax credit or directly or whatever. It doesn't matter how you actually slice it up. But if you look at the efficiency of current tax systems, you will be forgiven to think that the money you give to the rich will not be recuperated 100%, right, by the tax system. So in that sense, the universality. I understand the argument about universality. Everybody is involved. It's a bit like the Swedish welfare state. It's fine in general terms, but in this particular case, it's a waste of scarce resources because a lot of money will probably go into places where you can't get it back and where it's not needed. So from a public policy perspective, it's not an efficient use of resources. Then the third one is also a labor market argument. It's scarring effects. So if one thing seems certain is that, one of the key elements in the future labor market is training, retraining, and, continuous education, and also in transferable skills. I mean, you work at a very technically minded university, but, technical knowledge can be outdated very quickly. Right. Whereas sort of other knowledge, like that's why there was even an argument, an article published by the British economist John Kay, that a liberal arts education might be more relevant for the future than technical education, because technical education will always have to be upgraded and might be outdated very quickly. Whereas transferable skills like problem solving, creativity, and these sort of things, they will be key, employability factors going forward. But the fast turnover of technical skills also relates to the scarring element that I was referring to. If you decide, for instance, just on a basic income to stay out of the labor market for sort of a few years, you basically lose touch, you lose connection. And the longer you're out of the labor market, the less likely you are able to come back because the accelerating, skills gap will make that very unlikely. So, and then if you've been out of it for a certain time, that's known as the scarring effect, you're very unlikely to re-enter it going forward. And I don't think that's what we should do. It also does not solve the inequality problem. That's a key one for me, maybe even the most important one. Because if we're talking about, winner takes all structures and some going away, inequality is relative in society. It's not absolute. Whereas a basic income gives you an absolute level, whatever it is in society, but it doesn't fundamentally change the structure that a few people will run away with the spoils and a lot of people might be disadvantaged. So whatever the basic income is will be the new poverty line, right? So and the poverty, it's the new precariat. And the rest will still run away. And if you don't think about inequality in absolute terms, I mean, nobody's talking about, keeping you on $10 a day or something like that. But in a very rich society, even $1,000 a month or so, whatever, is a poverty level. Right? Poverty is relative. Inequality is relative to society, and just giving people a certain absolute amount per month or per year does not solve the dynamic that is corrosive to society, which is this inequality dynamic, which is pulling people apart. So a basic income doesn't address this at all, really at all. And the fifth one, that's maybe a specific European element, is about immigration, and in the European Union. In the European Union, you have free movement of workers and people, and you might get some thorny question of who is eligible for basic income and when. And at the moment we do not have significant or any sort of social policy driven migration to speak of. But imagine Germany introduced a basic income. and a poor person in Bulgaria would be could claim it. It simply wouldn't work that way, right? So that one is pretty obvious. So you would have to basically build walls around certain countries where the basic income exists. It doesn't work that way. So these are sort of some key problems I have with it, and then I sort of came up with a set of different ideas of how it could be addressed.
Okay, and so the different ideas that you have instead of universal basic income, and I have to say I share your skepticism about the basic income itself. But what would you do as an alternative? How would you deal with the potential for inequality in the future technology-oriented world? You've mentioned something called the democratization of capital, so maybe you might talk about that too.
Yeah, well, that's a nasty question, isn't it? It's easy to criticize other people's ideas, but it's much harder to come up with your own.
Of course.
So, but I came up with sort of a few key elements as well. I think the first two are pretty clear, which is I already touched on it. It's continuous education. Preparing for the labor market in the future is you will have to learn and learn again. And always update your skills. So education will play a much more prominent role going forward. It's very important now and will be even more important going forward. The second one is, if these technologies really unleash so much productivity, we're basically back where John Maynard Keynes was in the early 20th century when he was thinking about the economic fortune of his grandchildren. So we did not happen to get the 15-hour work week that he imagined, because we didn't in total decide to trade sort of money for leisure time. But we should think about reallocating the remaining work differently. So the overall trajectory, if you look at economic development, has been reduction of working times on average, right? So and recent polling, for instance, in Germany suggested also that there might be a preference to reduce job time more and have more time for family and leisure. So probably not 15 hours work week, but maybe 4 days a week or something like that, right? So and that obviously reallocating the remaining work in that way would keep more people employed, because each individual person would work less. So that was is one of the things you should look at. But the key of my thinking is and obviously the third one is tax reform. Yes, we need tax reform because of inequality. No, I don't think we need a robot tax, because what is a robot? And how do you tax it for tax purposes? The tax base is very difficult to, is your smartphone a robot? Do you want to tax a smartphone? And also, that specific tax might be, hindering innovation. So I'm not a fan of that tax. I think we need more progressive tax systems in general, right? But not a specific robot tax. So we need to talk. Yes, we need to talk about taxation as well. But sort of the key thinking of my solution is what you already mentioned: democratization of capital ownership and a job guarantee. Let me get to the job guarantee first. If we get the situation back to the idea of scenarios for labor market impact of technology, if we really get to the situation that jobs disappear on a massive scale, these will be jobs, i.e. activities that are market generated, right? So where the market basically says there is no economic value anymore, or the economic value of that activity lies elsewhere now. There is the human activity in this area doesn't make economic sense anymore. So it is a market-driven development. But as society, as human beings, I'm absolutely certain that we will never run out of ideas how to spend our time socially beneficial. Right? So whether you spend more time with your family, you engage in cultural activities, you care for people, we will never run out of idea. Even if nobody ever worked ever again, we would not run out of ideas how to organize ourselves socially in a way to create socially beneficial activities. So, and this is not market driven. So, and the job guarantee that I have in mind in that sense is to use money to incentivize these kind of jobs. And you could also use it to rejuvenate local communities. So, because I have a devolution idea with this as well. I mean, you could think about it. Say you have the money for sort of 5 different jobs in your local community, and the local community can decide what do we want to spend that money on. Do we want to have a football coach for the kids, a full-time football coach? Do you want to have a theater director? Do you want to finance an orchestra? You know, what do you want to do? So basically, it would be down to local communities to decide what they think this socially beneficial activity would be in their local community that then could be subsidized with these kind of guaranteed jobs. And they could also build a professional structure around voluntary sort of social engagement, right? So yes, you would obviously have still the people who you know, spend their free time in the football club teaching young kids how to play football or basketball, whatever, for free. But you have to have a full-time manager as well. So you can organize these people. So you can see how you can build a much richer structure around these activities. And that would also address another problem that I could see, is that, you know, the social fabric, especially on the local level, is tearing apart. So this would be beneficial in a way, because you could create activities, professional activities, that would help to sort of bring this sort of rebuild this social fabric of society. So, and this has nothing to do with the market in that sense. So, but it's socially beneficial activities. But you would have to pay for that, right? So how would you do that? And this is where you basically reallocate money from the economic realm again, because if the robots do all the work, the fundamental question is, who owns the robots? So it's not really the robots themselves, it's who owns the robots, because that's where the money will fall. And the democratization of capital ownership, I think that society at large, through different vehicles, should own more of the technology. That can be done on the individual level, what Richard Freeman, you know, from Harvard University, called the workers' share, where workers not just get a wage, but also shares. You know, you have more ownership, you get a capital income from your own company as well, not just a labor income. But also you could use special purpose financial vehicles on a state structure like sovereign wealth funds or whatever to just own much of certain companies. You don't have to take a majority ownership, but if you look at the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, that's oil funded. But you know, look at, for instance, the Volkswagen might be not a very popular example at the moment, but Volkswagen still, I'm not sure what the latest is, but was the global leader in car manufacturing. And it's 20% state-owned. The state of Lower Saxony owns 20% of Volkswagen. So basically, the 20% of the dividends, so the capital returns effectively, go into the public purse. So that's just one example. And look at state ownership in Singapore, for instance, right? So it's not like these things don't exist. So it's just that there is a sort of, for whatever reason, sort of a blockage in thinking, you know, why you should do it. I see personally no reason why, if this happens, the question is not not primarily, you know, that it happens, that the robots do the job, but, you know, where does the benefit go? As long as the benefit is widely socially shared, I don't think there is too much to be afraid of. Of course, you will have individual grievances and individual cases that we already talked about, where it will be tough and difficult. But if you make sure the financial windfall accrues to the public as well as to private actors, and use the public windfall to create socially beneficial activities, where some of the people who might lose their jobs can find meaningful work. It's the idea of meaningful, right? So, I mean, we haven't talked about populism, but if you look at some of the grievances that were were driving forces behind the Trump vote in the United States, is because the former workers in the Rust Belt felt that they were so cast aside. They had no meaning anymore to their lives or work lives at least, right? So creating meaningful work, meaningful activities where you get these rewarding effects that you had in your previous work, right? Social, also the social status that comes with it. So that I think is the task, and if that is done, I think I can see the puzzle pieces fitting much better together than, you know, compared with concepts such as the universal basic income, where it's just basically giving people who are affected a handout and then basically say, you know, that's it, don't bother me anymore.
So these are very positive suggestions, and, you know, valuable that there be a debate on these topics in the current place we're in with technology. How effectively do you think governments, though, are responding today to technological globalization?
I don't think very well, because a lot of them are still in the thinking that technology means sort of infrastructure, putting fiber optic cables in the ground, right? And they're only slowly waking up to the social consequences of this. And you know, and there will be more policy challenges on the horizon. I mean, the concept I'm working at the moment under the well, there's only been a German version of that, so this is sort of exclusive in English, basically. That what I call a 360-degree economy is basically, if you look at you're working also in the area of management and business. If you look at strategy theory, and if you look especially at the market-based view and the resource-based view of strategic management, right? So the idea is that the resource-based view says competitive advantage of companies is being created by having these resources, by tacit knowledge in processes. That's competitive advantage. But if you think about it, the more of these processes you digitize, the more you can copy and transfer them, by definition, right? So even though the first impact of sort of digitizing or of applying new technologies in more complex processes might be a reduction of cost, but the second point might be that tacit knowledge that used to be the competitive advantage might completely disappear, because if you have access to the same software and the same data, by definition, digital processes can be replicated and copied. So competitive advantage might disappear via this channel. At the very same time, on the market-based view, we are now seeing the early stages of the future markets, where technology is penetrating traditional markets. The traditional market segmentation is disappearing, completely disappearing. Give you the example of the car industry. I call it the future markets will be mostly information technology plus X in terms of skills. In the car industry, it's information technology plus engineering as a key skill. So, and at the moment you see basically players coming into this future market from two sides. You see the car companies, and you see technology companies such as Google with their autonomous driving, trying to enter this market from different angles, but you know, they're crowding into the same space. So now look at this. The technology component will become more and more important. The engineering component will become less important, because people, I'm not an engineer, but people tell me that, you know, if cars run on electric engines rather than combustion engines, they're much easier to build. So the engineering complexity will be reduced, whereas the technology skill will be appreciated. So there's a disadvantage of the engineering component. Another disadvantage is, you know, the chairman of Volkswagen the other day, the CEO of Volkswagen said that they're more likely to employ more software engineers going forward than engineers. Basically, in an effort to try to catch up with the IT component of what is required in this future market. But at the same time, vice versa, you look how much cash these technology giants have. So in this article that I wrote for Süddeutsche Zeitung, I compared, I think Apple has got something like $240 billion worth of cash stashed away. The whole market capitalization of BMW is something like 55 billion. So if they decided at some point to just buy the engineering component, they could do so, right? So so basically, I see from a strategic management point of view on these both components, on the research-based view and the market-based view, I see fundamental changes of technology in both areas. And the idea is that, of the 360-degree economy is basically competitive advantage might be disappearing. That is now locked in tacit knowledge. At the same time, market segmentations, traditional ones, are breaking up. So you see competitors entering market spaces from literally everywhere. So you have to have a holistic 360-degree view of the economy to try to make sense of it, right? So it's not good anymore as a car manufacturer to look at, your car manufacturer. Volkswagen looks at BMW and Mercedes and Fiat or whatever. But it's the Googles of this world. It's the Alibabas and the Tencents of this world, right? And that will fundamentally change. So that's still early stage research. So it's more hypotheses than actual finished research yet. But if these hypotheses are only halfway through, that's the next disruption of technology, where economic structures are completely changed, and that's what I'm trying to popularize in my sort of public policy activities as well. And as you rightly say, governments are either stuck still seeing technology as putting cables into the ground, or if they're one step further, they're looking at the labor market consequences of technology immediately. But for me, the next step is to try to look what it means. And companies don't have an incentive to look at this from a bird's eye view yet, because they look at what digitization means for themselves individually, right? And their direct competitors as they understand it at the moment. So I think this bird's eye view shows that it's a much more messy economic structure, almost an anarchic economic structure that we might be moving into. So and that is a business challenge for companies, as well as a challenge for policymakers trying to make sense out of that. So in that sense, yeah, so if you want to have it as a sort of a three-stage policy model for technology, is yes, you need to get the fastest cable into the ground. Yes, you need to deal with the already materializing consequences of some of the technological changes that we've seen. But also you really need to be forward-looking. Because if you don't think about these things now, I mean, for Europe, for instance, it's a very difficult situation. This Volkswagen, at the moment you see in this car space, for instance, also partnerships that might turn out to be competition relationships going forward. Volkswagen, in order to keep up with the technology companies, did what? They signed a partnership agreement with Microsoft. Why Microsoft? To my knowledge, Microsoft is one of the few big technology companies that don't have an own interest in autonomous driving yet. So what is the consequences? They're creating 2 research labs. Where are they based? One is in Seattle, one is in Beijing. What was the reasoning that the CEO of Volkswagen said in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in an interview? No European company could provide the services we needed.
Very interesting.
So in that sense, that's an immediate problem for European policymakers. So we have these initiatives such as a German Franco Research Institute for Artificial Intelligence. That's all nice and well. But what we need is companies in the market that can actually supply these kind of services now, because companies need them now. So and you might very well. At the moment, it looks like the structure is, you have 2 technological powerhouses where a lot of development is happening, which is in the United States with Silicon Valley, and which is China. So that's the development, and these are one of the and especially China. We talked about China before we started the interview. They have long-term development plans, right? So they think 5, 10, 15, 20 years ahead. And so that kind of long-term thinking, not in the political structures that China has, but that kind of long-term thinking is I think sorely missing in a lot of Western countries, maybe driven by electoral cycles and all the rest of it. But we need to establish that because then that's brings us back to where we started. I do think that we're going to see disruption on a bigger scale going forward, and especially that kind of sort of different economic structure might be a big disruption. So and we need much better strategic thinking around that in the business as well as in the policy world, I think.
Very interesting. You seem to be arguing that existing segmentation, particularly in economics, but perhaps elsewhere, governments need to be able to see beyond that and to look in a more systemic way at the impact that technology is having. And that really is a long way beyond where they are at the moment. It's causing them to think and to integrate their thinking, but in a number of areas where that integration doesn't yet exist.
Yeah, and you just have to look at the empiric evidence in that sense. I mean, the market segmentation is basically means there will be no more automotive sector that is just limited to automotive. It will be IT automotive, right? IT and engineering. So that will disappear. But you also another aspect that is important in this respect is technology companies have a advantage because of user network effects. They're already in a certain platform, and you can expand this. And actually, I'm keen to do more research on this year. But if you look at, for instance, look at Amazon, how Amazon developed as a company. As an online shop selling books and then moving into selling more products and logistics, that makes sense. That's a sort of linear development of a linear business model, right? We just sell more stuff and we get it to you. But how Amazon became the world leading cloud computing platform, how they became a producer of voice-enabled speakers, how they became a music distributor, a movie creator, right? And the discussion in the United States at the moment is who's going to first disrupt the healthcare sector. They're dabbling in healthcare now as well. Why? Because it's a big economic sector that is largely undisrupted at the moment, and especially in the United States shows a lot of inefficiencies. So that is not a linear expansion of a business. That is not what we would think of. We're just expanding, not the onion principle. We just go to the next layer. So and because they have already not just data on people, but also the leverage, because they have so many users that they use Amazon also for different things, insurance, healthcare, whatever, right? So that puts existing players in this space at a complete disadvantage, right? So you might get the car from Amazon, the healthcare from Amazon. The end game of Amazon is probably that they provide everything that you need. So that's probably what they want, and then they go into space, right? So with their space exploration, but that's at least the idea behind this. And traditional antitrust also doesn't work that way because they think in market power in a specific segment. So this user network effect doesn't really. Is not accounted for as much as I would like to see, as far as I can tell, in antitrust law, and at the same time, part of this anarchic structure is there's no saying that even these big technology giants are safe forever, right? So if you look at it now, Google wasn't the first search engine. It was the first one I used was Alta Vista. Nobody knows that anymore. Facebook wasn't the first social network. Right, so and then they're now so big that you can't really think how they can be displaced. But you could also see how the mood against Facebook, for instance, has shifted in the last year with Cambridge Analytica scandal, all sort of data leaks, what they did with your personal data, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't mean that because they have this hegemonic position now that they will have in perpetuity. So they might not be as safe as they think they are. So. Again, at the moment they have this sort of leverage and moving into all sort of markets where traditional players might be at a disadvantage, but at the same time they themselves could be again disrupted, from off-field, left field players coming in, right? So this is what I mean about the sort of 360-degree economy and almost anarchic structure that we might be moving into, and that's a challenge for business and policymakers, and I don't think we're at all there yet. And actually, how I moved to this was also literally from from the labor market consequences. And we talked about earlier how jobs can be seen as a sum of tasks. But for a company, and I was thinking about, what would that mean for a company rather than a worker? For a company, a job is a sum of tasks, and the jobs are tasks added up, right? So, and in these tasks, this is where the tacit knowledge sits, that according to the resource-based view is the source of competitive advantage. But if that is digitized and copied and whatever, right? So there is no competitive advantage anymore. You would still have different processes and so on and so forth, but the space you have to create this competitive advantage will be narrower. Like in a monopoly, if you have a monopoly supplier and everybody has got the same drill, the competitive advantage is no longer in the drill. Right. So, I mean, one example in Southwest Germany, somewhere in the Black Forest, there is nobody has probably ever heard of the company. I can't remember his name, but he's the almost monopolist, at least the key supplier of underground drills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So everybody using company, building, constructing underground trains. Or tunnels, there's no competitive advantage in this drill because everybody's got the same drill. Mm-hmm. So, and it might be similar that, if everybody's using the same software for task X, everybody's using the same for this. And the more you digitize these tasks, the more the danger is that a competitive advantage that used to be locked in a specific knowledge of this task might disappear because by definition, digital processes can be copied and transferred. So if the software and the databases is the same, so these are some of the challenges that I see, but that's sort of the next step on the horizon. But I think especially if you use this conversation with your students, I think that might be an interesting and they're going into businesses. That might be an interesting again framework for them to think through. What it might mean for their own business or the businesses they start working for going forward.
Absolutely. So I have a couple of further questions that I wanted to get to, which are, I guess, related to what we've talked about so far, but take a bit of a different, go into a couple of different areas. The first is you're in Berlin now. You moved there from London. And I know you've got opinions on how information technology influenced Brexit, which we still don't know the outcome of, but has already had quite an impact.
Yes, I mean Brexit is almost as anarchic a structure as the economy you might be moving into. I mean, as we record this, we're 1 week away from what is commonly referred to as the meaningful vote. I mean, it's very hard to discern any meaning in the whole saga. Yeah. But there you go. Yes, I mean, we will never be able to quantify in what specific ways. Social media, information technology, and so on and so forth influenced the vote. But I think 2018 was a watershed year, was a turning point year. We already touched upon, Facebook and, how people now view it differently, hashtag delete Facebook. Because the Cambridge Analytica scandal, to my mind, has shown for the very first time what is possible if you have a malicious intent in using social media, in using data, psychometric data, to break things up, really. I mean, previously, when you talk to people, they thought, if I give away my data, what is the worst thing that can happen? I just get more targeted Google ads and things like that, advertising, they couldn't, and I struggle, to be honest, also to think of a mass scale case where you could actually show what people with bad intentions could do. And the Cambridge Analytica scandal, I think, was for the first time because as the whistleblower revealed, the intention was literally to break society. That was the intention, to use psychometric profiles to break society up, because the idea of Bannon and maybe also others was you have to break things up first in order to remold it in the way you see fit. So and I think that has traditionally that has changed your mind. I mean, Germany has traditionally been very wary about data. Um, it's funny how people relate to that. I mean, in Germany, everybody would be completely up in arms if you had CCTV coverage, blanket CCTV coverage, as you have in the UK. But at the same time, people in the UK run against completely against the idea of having an ID card, right? So, but they're quite happy with having a blanket CCTV supervision. So you see, there's some sort of cultural differences in this. But I think people have now a bigger awareness, and also obviously the talk about how the American election was influenced by Russia allegedly, and allegedly other players, via social media, via bots, so on and so forth. They're becoming more aware that they're not just positive sides, and also now the latest leaks, the latest revelation that how companies at least thought about selling personal data, making profit out of it. So I think there's a new awareness in Germany for cultural reasons, because data privacy has always been higher on the agenda. I think the debate is a lot further. Because you talk about data sovereignty, people need to know what kind of data is being gathered, about them, and they need to be able to transfer it. GDPR in the European Union has been, I mean, even as a digital publisher myself, I had to jump a few hoops to become, our email list is compliant, because we always ask for double opt-in, always ask for permission. But it's good, the right to be forgotten, whatever. If somebody you had issues like revenge porn or things like that. If somebody just puts stuff about you personally on there, the idea that it's there forever and might haunt you for the rest of your life, it's just scary. So I think things like that, the right to be forgotten, and that you can request that this is being taken down and not to be found anymore. I think these are important things about data sovereignty. That the person themselves are still sovereign. So I think there will be more developments in this space in 2019 and going forward. I mean, it's quite an indication that people like Zuckerberg himself say we probably need regulation. You probably need also splitting up of some parts of these companies, right? So so there will be I think more developments in this space, but I think 2018 in this respect was a watershed year, and we're going to see more in that space.
Two final questions. The first, yep. You've talked a lot about Brexit and how technology is being applied to influence society. Is there a future for social democracy in the populist stage? As we're seeing more populism, more extremism, if we like, does social democracy, as we would understand it, have a future?
I hope so. But the jury's out. I mean, in party political terms, you see a lot of social democratic parties not faring very well. I'm a member of the German Social Democratic Party, and also helping to try to readjust policy programs. But it is very difficult because the social democracy traditionally has done well when there was an optimism about the future. Things get better, and progressive forces can shape that future for the better. At the moment, there's quite the opposite, right? So you have a lot of pessimism, even though the economic data, for instance, in Germany is good. It's well, right? But the anticipation is, well, things can only get worse, right? So that promise that our children will have it just a little bit better than our generation, right? So that is under threat, and that is one of the foundational threats. But at the same time, I see really a big problem in the UK, specifically because of Brexit. Whatever happened, the way society was hacked during the Brexit debate, and now in the year, there is a fundamental split. There is a fundamental split, and that's why the argument, don't have a second referendum, it will split society, is bogus in my view. Okay, we're back. Are we back?
Yep, it was just a few seconds, but you are back.
Yeah. So the idea that you shouldn't have a second referendum because it will split society is bogus in my view, because society is already fundamentally split, and it's better to have as Charles Grant of the Center for European Reform put it, it's better to have a split society with a better economy than having a split society with a worse economy, right? So, but another thing that is often overlooked is that one of the dividing lines between the Brexiteers is commonly the fault lines are being described as geographic, the cities against the rural areas, educational, the highly educated against the lower educated, and age, the younger people against the older people. But what is often overlooked is, what do have these categories together? We're broadly talking about the net taxpayers and the net tax recipients. So, and that's in my mind puts the welfare state under threat. If that social division persists, and it might well, because it's really a hard division, and the Remainers are feeling that they're being robbed of their way of life. Their children are being robbed of their opportunities. I know personal friends of mine who have family tensions, massive ones, because of that, right? So a son, accusing his father of destroying the lives of his grandchildren, and a father accusing his son of forgetting his roots. So we have that on a massive scale in the UK. But if the Remainers get the feeling of being robbed of their preferred way of life, and then the economy turns sour, and there will have to be cuts, and there will be austerity. To my mind, the preference would then be to wind down the welfare state, because basically they would say, why should I pay for the people who inflicted that on me, right? So why should I do that? I'll be doing fine. I can pay for private insurance or whatever, but why should I pay for you after you kicked me in the chin? So that might well be because the foundational principle of social democracy, or a welfare state based on a social democracy, is solidarity. And that feeling, that notion, that normative aspect of the welfare state, solidarity, is being fundamentally eroded by this split down the middle in British society. So even though, we won't talk about parties because that's a completely different story, but social democracy as a concept, I think is very much under threat, especially in the UK, because of these divisions. And if these divisions sour, in the United States might be a similar case in some instances. So if these divisions sour and turn out to be permanent, I feel that the fundamental notion of solidarity, which is underpinning and is a necessary precondition for social democracy, will weaken, and that the welfare state will be eroded. So I see a real danger there. So the jury's out, really.
Interesting. So the final question that I've got is for the people who might be watching this video. A lot of them will be students at the University of Waterloo. There may be others too. But for those students who might be embarking on engineering and technology focused careers, have you got any advice that you would like to share with them?
Yes, as I sort of briefly indicated earlier, I think my advice would be be broadly interested, right? So yes, follow technical education and upgrade your skills and keep that, but be wary of the social and wider societal impact technology has, and your own work has, and even if your profession might be just technology, you're necessarily part of society. So it will come to haunt you regardless of whether you think about it or not. And if you, and because the idea is to end on a positive note, is I see a lot of young people are very enthusiastic, right? And that's great. We need that kind of enthusiasm in our societies. And, if that kind of thinking about the social problems we are currently experiencing and how economic and technical developments inform and sort of relate to these social problems, if that leads to sort of them playing an active role in trying to address these issues. Some of the major issues we haven't even talked about. Climate change, the elephant in the room, right? So we talked about a small area of the problems that are coming, but there is obviously a much wider set of social problems. And I think the awareness that you're necessarily, even though you might be at a university that puts the focus on technical education, you're necessarily a part of this, and it's in your own interest and in society's interest that you yourself try to play a positive role in trying to address some of these issues. You yourself and society at large will both benefit.
Thank you, and thank you for taking the time to talk to me in this interview, Henning. It's I know going to be valuable for the students. The areas we've talked about, I think, are extremely important, and hopefully this video will contribute to better understanding and better solutions to the challenges that we now face.
Thanks, Peter, for having me. It was a pleasure.